We'll start that thing all over again. All right. Okay. Try number 2. Hello again, everybody. Welcome, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Persis Yu. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Protect Borrowers Action, a nonprofit organization launched in the wake of the Supreme Court's callous decision to deny over 40 million student loan borrowers of critically needed debt relief. Our mission is to educate, activate, and mobilize the millions of people with student debt across the country to demand bold action to address the student loan crisis and to hold public officials accountable when they prioritize special interests over the financial well-being of their own constituents. We are so excited to partner with AFT today and bring you this briefing on the politics of student debt. For far too long, the issue of student debt was swept under the rug. Students and families just trying to invest in their futures, in their families, in their communities, have been burdened by what too many people have called good debt. This debt has weighed down generations of Americans and their families. It has prevented older Americans from retiring. It has hindered homeownership and entrepreneurship, and it has prevented young folks from starting and growing their families. I do think it's fair to say that the way that we talk about student debt today is very different than the way we talked about student debt a decade ago. Many more people now do recognize that student debt is a really big deal. And I think this is in large part due to the Biden administration proposing one of the most sweeping debt relief programs in the history of this country, and also because of the blatantly political decision by the Supreme Court to rip that debt relief away from 40 million Americans. But when we talk about student debt, and I mean, people like those of us in the room, when we talk about student debt, we talk about things like negatively amortizing loans and lifetime repayment rates and the difference between garnishments and offsets. But I think in this moment, right now, after we've seen 4 million borrowers receive over $140 billion of student debt relief, and with the presidential election just around the corner, now is the time that we have to understand how everyday Americans talk about student debt at their kitchen tables. And that is the very conversation that we are excited to get started here today. We are very excited to share the results of a new poll conducted by pollster John Della Volpe of Social Sphere, offering a comprehensive look at voter attitudes on student debt relief and the 2024 election. At Protect Borrowers Action, we are very fortunate to be working with Social Sphere. Many of you already know John. He is a longstanding director of polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics and leads the Institute's polling on American youth. He's a pollster and advisor to Biden in 2020 and has written and spoken extensively about the attitudes and behaviors of young voters. Immediately after John's presentation, Michael Stratford of Politico is going to lead John and I, along with 2 of the most formidable experts in the field, Bharat Ramamurthy, formerly with the White House National Economic Council, and Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federations of Teachers, in a discussion about what this poll means for borrowers and the election. So I hope that you all will enjoy today's presentation. And with that, John, I'm going to turn it to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Persis. Pleasure to be here. I have a handful of slides I'm going to walk through over the next 10 minutes or so, but with the help of our friends, we'll flip through these together. But this is a presentation that was actually the most in-depth and comprehensive study I've ever undertaken on this important issue. It's a survey of more than 3,800 interviews on a national basis. 2,600 of those interviews plus were conducted with members of Gen Z and the millennial generation. I'll walk into some detail about that. But the first slide I want to show you is essentially the key findings from a set of 5 focus groups that I conducted in February. I always believe that generally before almost any survey that we write, that we need to actually talk to the subjects and identify in their own words how the issues that we care so much about are affecting them, their lives, and their families. And the big takeaways from the qualitative research that were the hypotheses that we developed to write the the survey instrument were the following. One, there was a desire for financial stability, security, and comfort across the groups. And the groups included members of Gen Z, millennials, and some Gen Xers, people in the early 50s, some who had graduated from college and others who had not graduated from college. But top of mind, there was this sense of stability and normalcy around finances and independence, one. The second thing is when I talked about and probed about what government could do to create that stability, organically we heard issues related to student debt relief bubble up before we even began to probe. This was something that was top of mind, as Persis said, literally I think on the kitchen table conversations that so many Americans are having today. Third, for those out of school, student debt raised anger, feelings of anger and regret and concern about not knowing all the facts, and perhaps their decision would have been different if they had known the facts that they know now. Number four, significant support and desire for debt relief felt out in the groups. We want to quantify that, of course, in the survey, which we will. There was very low awareness on the record of the Biden-Harris administration. We probed a number of different ways around that. We'll show you the quantitative results of just how much people know about the, as Persis says, $140 billion of student debt relief for 4 million Americans. It was actually helpful to walk through the timeline over the last several years to see the reaction of folks in the focus group. And then lastly, when we were talking about the decision-making process that people were having regarding the election, we could see that the role that the administration has played combating the decision from the Supreme Court to relieve debt for so many Americans was an important factor when choosing who to support in the upcoming election. So I want to share, because I think it's just so important that we try to bring some of the humanity behind the numbers that I'll show you in a moment. I'll just show you just a few quotes from the focus group. So the next slide, please. As I said, this was an organic, top-of-mind issue. It's omnipresent in the lives of so many people. On the left-hand side, you'll see a female college graduate said, college debt is it's like, quote, a giant anchor pulling you into the depths of the sea. Someone without a college degree says, I owe more than what I initially borrowed. It feels very overwhelming. So these, again, are the quotes and the conversations that we try to quantify in the survey instrument. The next slide, you'll see that there was frustration across most of the groups that high school didn't inform students about the potential impact of student debt. This is from another young woman without a college degree. She says, I am really angry about the brainwashing that minors go through, that they must go to college. Literally every adult in my life, at church, at school, at home, told me that. There was no other path mentioned. And then I go to college and it's the worst financial investment of my life. One more. The level of support for canceling student debt was clear. As I said, as were views that forgiveness would provide stability for millions of vulnerable people. And not only that, but also boost the economy more generally. We hear this consistently. I don't see somebody renting, paying student loans, and still having up the money to pay down, to put down on a home. If that loan forgiveness was there, more people would be able to go out and purchase homes or newer cars. So this was impetus to write a series of questions, which I'll share with you, about the role that this would have on the economy more generally. And lastly, people would be a bit more stabilized in their lives. I think that canceling student loan debt could potentially keep people off of welfare. So it could have a nice little ripple effect if their debt was released. These are just common themes that came up through a very organic conversation, and there are several other quotes just like this across the 5 focus groups. So the next slide, again, just to remind you of the overview, this survey included 3,812 registered voters between March 15th and March 19th, with over 2,600 oversample of Gen Z and millennials, Gen Z voters between 18 and 26. We break millennials into 2 categories, younger and older, ages 27 through 43. Overall, slightly more than a quarter of everyone registered voter in the survey either had or someone in their home had student debt. And you can see that the younger you are, the more likely you are to have this. But it's not just an issue that younger people are dealing with. You can see here that nearly a quarter of Gen X has someone or themselves, someone in their home with student debt, and about 1 in 7 baby boomers are members of the silent generation. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. and I'm going to walk you through the quantitative. Okay, so the first question we'll share is a question about views related to student debt. And survey respondents had 4 options. Okay, 1, that government should cancel student debt, loan debt for everyone. That government should cancel student loan debt only for those most in need. That government should not cancel loan debt, but help with repayment options. Or the government should not change student loan policy or cancel any more debt. Okay? Those were the 4 options. And you can see here clearly that 7 in 10 voters believe that government should take some action on student loan debt, including 67%, 2/3 of folks who already paid off their loans. Okay? You can see here that 91% of Americans, regardless of their age, who have student loans, support government action. 87% of people in their households. Again, 2/3 of people who are already paid off their loans. And 64% actually, that last bar, the last column on the right, 64% who never had and don't have loans still support government action to address student debt. And 90% of folks whose loans were already canceled support that. Next slide. We'll break this down again. Strong majorities of Democrats, regardless of age, of independents, and younger Republicans favor government intervention on student debts. Again, if you look at, basically, if you add up those first 3 boxes, okay, 23% overall of all voters believe that government should cancel all student debt. 27% should cancel student debt for those most in need, and another 23% believe we should help with repayments. So again, if you net those 3 boxes, you can see 94% of younger Democrats, 88% of older Democrats, 75% of younger Republicans under the age of 44 believe that government should take action to relieve folks of their debt. 50% of older Republicans, 82% of younger independents, and 2/3 or 65% of older independents. Net those 3 options. Okay? Next slide. We wanted to ask a series of questions about when they think about the election for Congress, how important are the following issues? And too often we see questions like this where, you know, immigration or inflation or the economy generally are the 1 or 2 most important issues, but that doesn't mean that they're the only issues. We found here that 48% of all registered voters say that canceling student debt is a very or somewhat important issue in the upcoming election for president and for Congress. In particular, you can see 70% of younger voters, 66% of younger millennials believe that's a very or somewhat important issue. And again, close to half of members of Gen X, which are folks in their mid to late 40s through their late 50s, believe this is an important issue in the upcoming election. It's a critical issue, of course, for African American and blacks, people of color, including Hispanics, where more than 2/3 say this is a very or somewhat important issue. In fact, in those 2 subgroups, they are twice as likely as registered voters who are white and Asian American, Pacific Islanders, to say it's a very important issue. Next slide. Beyond being an issue, we asked a series of economic policy initiatives, and we want to see how much impact individual voters thought that these policies could have on them and their family if enacted. Okay? So this was a broad and comprehensive survey, and what we found was for those Americans who currently have student loan debts, they found that canceling or forgiving, we did a split sample just to look at word choice, were the most impactful policies that would impact their family in a positive way. Okay, so 86% of those with student loans, which is almost 1,000 people in our survey, say that forgiving student debt, 68% said that would help their family a lot. 86% said it would help their family a lot or little. Okay, that is significantly higher than general ideas related to creating jobs, requiring billionaires to pay their fair share of taxes, tax credits for first-time home buyers, et cetera, et cetera. Those were also important issues, but relatively speaking to those issues, canceling or forgiving student debt was number one, seen as the number one most impactful thing that folks who have student debt, the government could do to help them and their family. When we, next slide, we looked at the same question, not just among people who have student debt, but among all members of the Black African American community and all members of the Hispanic community and white registered voters. And regardless of whether or not they have debt, 66% of African Americans and blacks, 66% of Hispanics said canceling student debt policy would have a positive impact, help a lot or help a little on their immediate family. 60% of blacks, 36% of whites, and again, over 40% of those two groups of color indicated that this policy would help their family a lot, regardless of whether or not they themselves or someone in their family had debt. Next slide. Similar, it's a similar take. Again, I just also wanted to show the partisan and generational divides because there are some issues. There are some issues in America today where younger Democrats and younger Republicans sometimes have more in common than younger Democrats and older Democrats, or younger Republicans and older Republicans. And this is one of those. This is one of those issues in many ways. Okay. Again, will help a lot. Will help a little. The question is thinking now just about the economy. Okay, about the broader economy. If enacted, what impact do you believe the following policies would have to strengthen America's economy? So we're not just talking about the impact on the household, but the economy more general. We can see that 53% of all registered voters indicate that forgiving student debt, there's really not much of a difference between forgiving and canceling. Forgiving student debt would have a positive impact on the economy, strengthen the American economy. Only 24% say it would have a negative impact and hurt it. Okay, so it's a 2-to-1 in favor of helping the economy more broadly. It is, you can see that for younger Democrats, 74-9, 74% help a lot or a little, 9% hurt. Older Democrats, 72-9, very little difference when we're looking at the broader economic consequences in the minds of Democrats. There is a significant generation gap among Republicans. Younger Republicans, Gen Z and younger millennials and older millennials, by a 2-1 measure, believe that canceling student debt or forgiving student debt would have a net positive impact on strengthening America's economy. Their older Republicans feel differently. It's 30 positive, 46 negative. But when we look at independent voters who are younger, again, more than 2-to-1 positive, 69-25. And among those independents who are in their 50s or older, it's basically a draw. As many believe it will help as hurt. It's 33% help, 32% hurt. It's basically a third, and 31% not knowing or not believing it's going to have a significant impact. Next slide. Across generations, when we talk about how, I showed you those quotes, we try to quantify those quotes in some ways by sharing some messages around canceling student debt. And essentially kind of what this says is across generation, across political divides, loan status, messages that connected with the idea of easing the burdens of lifetime debt, creating economic stability, and boosting working class Americans, those are the ones that move voters who could then see the broader economic impact of debt relief. I'm just going to read this first one, and I think it echoes what we heard in the qualitative. Many borrowers have been paying off their loans for years or decades, but because of the interest they still owe, more than they originally borrowed. Taking out a loan to pay for education should not result in a lifetime of debts. 68% of all voters found that to be convincing, 76% of younger, and 63% of voters who are Gen X in the mid-50s or older found that statement is a convincing reason to relieve student debt. I just have a couple more slides, but the next slide will show, there's a lot of arrows here. You can see all of the arrows move from left to right. The question that we did pre and post was overall, how much, as I said, do you think that canceling student debt would help or hurt the economy? Okay, we just did a subtraction, help versus hurt, so we could see this net number. And then we asked it after reading those messages. And you can see overall there was a 10-point shift, which is a very significant shift, and the net belief, and the belief that canceling student debt would boost and strengthen America's economy. Every single group here shifted, most of them in a significant way. The group that shifted the least were Gen Zers because they had already overwhelmingly supported that concept, right? But I think what is notable is you can see that Gen Xers switched by 8 points, Boomers and Silent Generation moved by 7 points, Republicans moved by 11 points. It was a net negative, as I said, toward draw afterward. So these are messages that connect to all Americans. Lastly, I wanted to quantify the question I've been asking in all of my focus groups for quite a while. I always ask about do voters, specifically younger voters, understand and appreciate the role that government has in their lives, right? And the role that government has in the lives of those that they care about, and ask for examples. And it's hard. It's a hard question to get responses to. And in the focus groups, we'll say, how much do you think has been relieved in student debt? And I don't expect my focus group participants to be experts in this, but it's always interesting to see what they guess, okay? And we know that if you see the next slide, that the Biden-Harris administration over the last just a few years relieved, what is it, almost $140 billion, right, in student debt. Well, only 11% of American voters were even close to that number, 11%. What we did, we said, I don't like to quiz people, but I said, what is your best guess as to how much student debt was canceled because of policies enacted by President Biden? Okay, I said, and these were choices. I said none, 10 million, 100 million, a billion, 100 billion, or a trillion. And you can see here that it's really no significant difference. Okay, it's those the second. You can see that was in order. Almost no significant difference based upon age. 11% overall, 12% of Gen Zers, 11% of younger millennials, 11% of older millennials, 12% of Gen Xers, and 11% of Boomers and Silent think that the president and the vice president have relieved more than $100 billion in debt. In fact, Gen Zers were more likely to say that they knew and less likely to actually, they were more likely to think that they relieved much less than that. So I think it's a best kept secret, one of the best kept secrets in American politics today. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it over to Michael.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here today. I guess we can just dive into it based on John's presentation. I'm curious, a few things stood out to me, including that last point about the lack of awareness of what the Biden administration has done already on student debt, and that other data point about of the voters you surveyed, voters ranking student debt relief as even higher than job creation, as how important it was to them. So I'm wondering, maybe we can just go down the line, and I'd be curious to hear from all of you what you saw as the implication from the presentation of how the Biden administration, how the Biden campaign should be talking about what it's done on student debt and what it may, in the coming months, do in the future. Maybe Brett, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's a couple takeaways from my perspective. Number one, this is a highly effective and motivating issue for the administration and for the campaign to be talking about, particularly with younger voters. But as John pointed out, it isn't just exclusively 18 to 35. There's a lot of people who, older people who have debt, or people in their household who have debt, who realize what a big deal this is. Second of all, I think what I've noticed, having worked on this issue for a long time, including at the White House, is that there are a lot of sort of opinion columnists who think that this is a third rail type of issue or hot button issue where, sure, some people are motivated by it, but then there's a whole other group of people who feel extraordinarily resentful of the idea of canceling student debt for people because, God damn it, they worked hard and they paid off their own debts, right? Or they never had debt and they didn't go to college, so why are other people getting this handout? And I think what comes through in this data and comes through in all the data we ever saw was that that's not really the case except for a relatively narrow sliver of voters and people. And honestly, the people who feel that resentment most strongly are high-income people who have graduate degrees. People who don't have a college degree are actually more supportive than average of student debt cancellation, even though they may not have debt of their own. And I think it's in large part because they understand how the deck is stacked against people who come from lower income or middle income families who want to get a college degree, who understand that that's important, but have to take on an enormous amount of debt. And so even if they haven't personally experienced that, they, I'm sure, have people in their family or in their social circle who feel that pressure, who feel that financial strain, and they think it's the right thing to do for the government to relieve that debt. So to me, the more the administration and the campaign can get out there and talk about this issue in the framing that John described about why this is the fair thing to do, why it's good for the economy. And at the end of the day, what always came through to me was this is a concrete, tangible, and immediate form of relief. Right? If you build infrastructure, that's great. Maybe the roads near your house will get better 2 years from now. Right? If you improve childcare opportunities, well, maybe you don't have a kid, or maybe you're not reliant on childcare. But there's 45 million people with student loan debt, and if you cancel their student loan debt, that will make an immediate impact in their life, and they will know it's because of something that the government did. And so for that reason, it's always struck me as a very potent political motivator.
Randy, a lot of those voters are your, or a lot of those borrowers are your members,
Right.
and you've been pushing from the outside to get the administration to take action on a lot of these areas. How would you like to see the White House talk about this in the campaign?
So the short answer is exactly the way John just portrayed it. The longer answer is that I think if I take a step back and just also remember the debate, the surround sound around the Supreme Court was so completely unfair and unjust, but it actually went into this underlying message of, okay, you're not worth it. And the shame, the fear, I did it, why can't you, completely misread not only where people are in the country, and I found it really interesting, this generation gap of young people, both of whom are saying, you haven't told me in high school all of my possibilities, as well as across the ideological range, young people saying, wait a second, I should not have this anchor or Advil or whatever you want to call it on my legs sinking me down. I think that the data shows us that young people want aspiration, and they are willing to do what we tell them they should do to get fulfillment, aspiration, opportunity. But it's just really unfair. And the way in which debt is hurting them, student debt is hurting them, it's really unfair. And I think that what the Biden administration should do is talk about how, just like in other areas in the economy, like rebuilding manufacturing in this country, like bringing chips in so that we don't have a national security issue, like rebuilding bridges and tunnels. And today, of all days, that Infrastructure Act is really important. But the other piece is, how do you make sure, just like how you increase wages, how do you make sure that young people have a fair shot in life after they go to college or after they go to get other certifications? And I think that this fairness argument is really important. And I think that's what this is portraying as clearly as possible. We tell kids all the time, go to college, go to college, go to college. I probably said it too fast. Go to college, go to college, go to college. we don't tell them about other opportunities. And then, particularly for first-generation college goers, where there's no wealth in the family to rely on, then it is unsustainable for the rest of their lives for so many people. That's what we see in our membership. And so what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are doing are just making it fair and making sure that there's real opportunity and that kids have a shot at their dreams.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think we already know, but I think that this poll highlighted is that Americans are looking for and they want to support policies that are going to improve their lives, right? And that's what debt cancellation does. Just last week, Randy and I had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of borrowers who had their loans canceled, and it is life-changing. It is truly, genuinely life-changing for folks to have that debt burden lifted off of their shoulders.
Can I just say, one of those folks who were there
Yes.
was in her 60s,
Yes.
and when she came, when she was supposed to, when we had organized it initially, she still had loans, and that day, she was a career changer.
Yeah.
That day, she found out her public service loan forgiveness was forgiven. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. It was incredible. And she was there at this event in tears talking about how life-changing this was because she thought it wasn't going to happen for her. And, you know, there were borrowers talking about how they thought they were never going to retire, but now they could. There was a borrower who was working a second job to pay what she called her second mortgage, and now she could work just one job, right? Like, this is genuinely life-changing relief, and it has been delivered to 4 million folks. But I think what we also know is that there's a lot of borrowers who are waiting for that relief. And so I think what we need to hear from the president is that this relief has happened, and it is amazing. And it is amazing for those borrowers for whom it has happened, but it is still in the works, and it will happen for millions more borrowers. And I think that's the message that we need to get across, is that the relief is coming. I think many young people feel like they've been blamed for their situation, right? They have been blamed, saying that, well, you made this financial decision. Well, as you know, Randy said, you know, and as we heard from this quote, it's like people are told over and over and over again, go to college, go to college. Well, now you went to college, and it's your damn fault that you have this debt, right? And it is not a personal failing; it is a policy failure, and the administration is working to fix the student debt crisis, fix the broken policies, and deliver that relief to folks.
John, you alluded at the end that you called it you thought it was a secret weapon of this campaign. How should the Biden campaign deploy it and talk about it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as was mentioned, I took a leave from Harvard and advised and did a lot of polling on young people during the campaign. And it's somewhat of a simplification, but I think younger people voted in record numbers in 2020, record numbers. They were responsible in large part for flipping these 5 battleground states from red to blue. Republicans win voters over the age of 45 consistently. They did in 2020. They did in 2022. It was the double-digit margins of folks under the age of 30 that flipped those 5 battleground states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Right? And they did so simplifying for 3 reasons, right? For progress on 3 issues: on climate, on gun violence prevention, and on student debt. And on each of those issues, there are tangible differences that young people created because of them showing up and voting. Okay, that's what keeps young people in the process, when they can see the tangible difference that voting makes. I've been doing this for 25 years. Many times, many cycles, more young people volunteer than vote because they don't see the difference between the parties or their governments, jaded, et cetera. So they go out and help other people, right? That's, to me, the most important tactic and strategy and message that we all need to communicate, especially to younger people who are just not as comfortable with this process and regular voters. Government matters. There's $140 billion of debt relieved because of what young people did. It's a different and better country, and you've changed millions and millions of lives. So that, to me, would be the message for all of us who care about government, actually, regardless of whether or not you're running for re-election or not.
One part of your polling that I didn't find surprising is that voters couldn't peg the amount of debt that's been forgiven. And I mean, I think you can understand because there have been so many numbers floating out in the press because a lot of this debt has been forgiven and approved for forgiveness in different batches for different existing programs for different types of borrowers. All of those different buckets have different contours of what the eligibility requirements were for. And that was in part because there are a lot of moving pieces have been within the administration for making changes to existing programs, using some of the COVID era flexibilities to waive existing requirements, writing new rules. And we don't need to get into all the different buckets there, but I wonder how it seems like there is a bit of a challenge in how the administration should be talking about that because there are disparate groups of borrowers. They have this overall number that they're talking about, and then there's yet still an indeterminate number of people who will be getting relief in the future, and all of that nuance doesn't lend itself to good political messaging, I don't think. So I'm wondering what you all think the right balance is of talking about sort of the mechanics. And Brett, you were the architect of a lot of those different programs. What is the right balance of talking about debt that's been forgiven, for whom, under what conditions, versus I'm providing relief in the future?
No, I think it's a hard question in my opinion because what I've found is that if you are talking to people who are skeptical of the idea of debt relief, it's extremely persuasive to be able to say to them, a large amount of the debt that has been forgiven so far is under a law that's been around since 2007, and it says that if you do 10 years of public service and make your payments for 10 years, you get your debts forgiven at the end of it. And there's people who've done all of that and submitted their paperwork, and they didn't get their debts forgiven. And all we are doing is going back and giving people the relief that they've deserved. These are teachers and firefighters and nurses and service members and so on. That really moves the needle with a lot of people who are very skeptical about it. Now, the flip side of that is that there are tens of millions of borrowers who are not in that position and don't see themselves in that form of relief. And so if you want to talk about it more like that, then you're potentially excluding people and making them feel like they're not going to get some kind of relief. To me, the right way to talk about it is to critique the system overall, right? Because I think that's where a lot of people are, is to say, cost of college has gone way up. People who are just going to get a 2-year degree, 4-year degree are graduating with tens of thousands of dollars of debt at high interest rates. And then, it's going to take them decades to pay this off. And, we, the government, shouldn't be profiting off of the student loan system. We shouldn't be saddling people with decades worth of debt just to go get a degree, and we need to provide relief to people. At the same time, by the way, that we tackle things like try to reduce the cost of college at the front end and go after institutions that are not providing value for their degree. When we announced the debt relief plan, we tried to make sure we had those 3 pillars, right? This is relief for people now. Here's what we're going to do to fix the system. Here's what we're going to do to hold colleges accountable for not treating students well. And I think that remains the best way of talking about it. But I think, again, it's nice to have as a fallback when people say, all these people are so undeserving, people who with college degrees make more money anyway, why do they need relief, is to be able to go back and say, well, part of this is for people who were told that if they did certain steps, they would get debt relief, and were denied that relief even though they did everything they were told. Don't you think that that's fundamentally unfair? And I think that's a helpful rejoinder for a lot of those critiques.
Randy, how do you think about this? Because on the one hand, the public service loan forgiveness is a big chunk of the total figure that the administration is touting. But you and other unions have been influential in trying to push for more and broad-based debt relief. How do you think about the balance of talking about what's been done versus what needs to, in your view, get done in the future?
So I, and you could hear it in my first answer too, I think this fairness argument about how we are burdening young people as opposed to how we are creating opportunity for them is going to be the most important argument. Because it's a unifying argument as opposed to some of the PSLF and other arguments. And I'll say it this way. My members are some of the prime recipients of PSLF. I mean, we, as many of you in this room know, we sued Navient, we sued DeVos, we've just worked with Persis and others about the Mohila papers, because Mohila appears to be a worse student debt servicer than Navient, something I didn't think was possible, but is. So there's the issues of, somebody is trying, but Mohila is making it impossible. Those are arguments that I think work across the spectrum. The law that said that if you go into public service was passed by or signed up by George W. Bush, bipartisan law, and we have to make it actually work. So instead of it being less than 2% of the people who should be eligible actually got eligibility under Betsy DeVos, now it's 98% of the people getting eligibility. I think all of that is really important. But I think what happens, and one of the reasons why there was not the groundswell that I think there should have been after the student debt case was rejected by the Supreme Court, is that we have to make this, and the administration has to make this an all argument, which is the social contract. Sorry, I am a social studies teacher. The social contract essentially says if you actually go to college or do something post-secondary, then in the economy of the 21st century, you're going to be able to fully participate. And you will be able to give back to your country and fully participate if you do all that. And we have to make it reasonable for people to be able to do that, and then they'll also live their lives, own a house, have a family. And what you see underlying John's statistics or John's polling here is that the issues of inflation show up here, and costs show up here in so many different ways. It shows up in the cost of student debt. It shows up in the cost of college. And it feels like for young people that we're actually Charlie Chaplining them, making them go run so fast and so much, and they can never get off that wheel. And so I do think, I'm not sure that I have the right words, but this is a fairness argument. Just like when we said to GIs who came back from World War II, this is your country. This baby boomers, thank you for what you did. This is your country. We have to do the same for younger generations, and we can't burden them so much that it makes it impossible for them to make the same patriotic choices of having a family, owning a home, and being an American.
Persis, what do you think are the more salient arguments for the administration to make of the ones that are, I think the administration has made all of these arguments at varying times, so you sort of have to prioritize, I guess, when we're doing some of this messaging. The administration has said, good for the economy, this is an earned benefit when talking about PSLF, that this is, we're fixing a system that wasn't connecting people with the benefits they earned, especially in the context of the first debt relief plan, relief in the context of the economic fallout from the pandemic, talking about racial student debt as a racial equity issue. And I think as we're moving into this next plan, there's been a lot more discussion about the sort of taxpayer cost benefit trade-off of the government continuing to collect on this debt, and some, including yourself, have made the argument that much of this debt may not be collected at all by the government, and that should be a basis for writing it off. I assume you've made all of those arguments at some point. Which ones stand out, do you think, is the most salient in the context of this sort of political conversation we're having?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I step back and think about it, I think that there is really just one big unifying argument around that, and that what we're doing is not working, right? The Higher Education Act was passed and student loans were created for the purpose of generating economic mobility and financial stability, right? And what we've seen, whether or not we're talking about the income during, account adjustment, whether or not we're talking about the PSLF waiver, whether or not we're talking about, relieving the debts of students who were defrauded by their schools, is that the system's broken, right? And so the $140 billion of debt we've seen relieved is about fixing a piece of the broken system. But when you have families sitting around their kitchen tables wondering if they can save this month, struggling because payments just turned on after 3.5 years and they don't know where that extra $200, $300, $500 is going to come from, that's also not working, right? It's not working when we're giving federal money to fraudulent schools, but it's also not working if students are getting their degrees and not able to participate in the economy. That the system is broken and it is not working. And so, we do need these policies on a broad, different level. It's not working for middle class folks. It's not working for lower income folks. And it's not achieving the goals of which this entire system was built to achieve, which is that of economic mobility and financial stability. And so I think that is really the framework that we should be thinking about this is the purpose of the Higher Education Act. This is the purpose of higher education, and student loans were supposed to help, but they've actually hurt. And so that system is broken and we need to fix it.
I want to switch gears a little and talk about some of the opposition to these policies, which has been driven by Republicans, both in the courts, as we've talked about, on the Hill through efforts to block some of the administration's policies through legislative action. There are more lawsuits threatened. John, you mentioned some of the populations of people who were viewed student debt relief unfavorably. Do you have a sense of whether those voters are galvanized or motivated by their opposition to student debt relief in the same way I think you were talking about it as a galvanizing issue for younger Democratic voters, even some younger Republican voters?
It's an excellent question. I can't tell you that I see that, in the qualitative or in the quantitative. But let me tell you who those people are, right? Those are folks who are older. Those are folks who, when they were teenagers in their 20s, they could work a summer job for 13 weeks and afford a year of tuition at not just any public but any private university in America in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. So I spent so much time, around generations and asking younger people, what don't people like me or what don't other folks in society who are older understand about you and your generation, and that is often one thing, right? So like the more conversation that we can have about just a different circumstance, for younger people today to achieve the same dreams and goals that even their parents or neighbors had. So I think that's important, that context. Just a couple of other things, if I could, just around, you talked about like what would the Biden administration sort of say. I'm certainly not anywhere close to being an economist, but I do think there are three important things to take away from this. One is that Biden-Harris administration shares the values of millions of Americans, not just young people, but majority of younger Republicans, regardless of where they are ideologically. So I think, to me, it's about values always are more important than message, right? So one is, this is understanding of values, one. The second thing is, President made a promise to younger people in 2020, and he kept the promise, right? And I think that is so important, regardless of the details of the policy. It's, again, creating trust in governments. And the third thing is, as represented by Bharat and so many other people, it's an administration led by someone who has experience in putting teams together to get things done, even when it's difficult, even when the Supreme Court tries to roll it back. So I think those three messages are just so important to encourage younger people to participate. Values are aligned, there's experience to get things done, and you make a promise, you try to keep it, and then you got to tell people about it. And there are 4 million people. I don't know, it would be great if those 4 million people whose lives have been changed told their friends and neighbors, right? That's 8 million people, 12 million people. And that's how I think, and I think this will be happening. It is happening now, but I think that much more can be done, from the ground up as well.
Yeah. I just want one addition to that is, I know that awareness of the exact amount of debt that Biden has canceled is relatively low, or people are having a hard time. But I remember seeing separate polling from a couple of months ago where they asked people, "Are you aware of this thing that President Biden has done?" And it basically listed every single major accomplishment of the administration. And Biden tried to cancel student loan debt was the highest awareness out of all those things, higher than infrastructure, higher than Medicare drug price negotiation, higher than the CHIPS Act, et cetera. Again, I think reflecting the fact that this was directly affecting the financial situation of 40 million people, and then beyond that, family members were aware of it, and of course, it generated a lot of discussion in the public. I remember we announced the plan on a Wednesday, and then on that Friday there was a big wrestling event, and one of the wrestlers came in and was doing where they talk smack at the beginning, and he was like, "I'm going to cancel you the way that Biden canceled student debt," and the crowd roared. So they're not doing that for the infrastructure bill, okay? So the point is, we're sort of, people already know that a lot of people already know that it happened. So you might as well go out there and make your best argument for it. You can't hide from it. And I think one little gloss that I think is really helpful is that I think there's a real misconception among a chunk of the public about who student loan borrowers are. Correct. And I think a lot of people think, oh, these are all doctors and lawyers, right? What is it? Probably half the people with student loan debt are doctors and lawyers. No, 3%, 2 to 3% of people with student loan debt are doctors and lawyers, right? Meanwhile, 60% of people with student loan debt are Pell Grant recipients, which means they came from low-income families, many of them the first people in their families to go to college. 35% of people with student loan debt have no degree, right? So there's 10 times as many people with no degree as compared to having a JD or an MBA or an MD. So again, once you try to educate people about that, and I think you can do it by putting that data in front of them and saying this is really a fundamentally a middle class problem. 30 years ago, part of a middle class lifestyle is that you maybe would get that college degree, like you said, you'd go work a minimum wage job, you graduate without debt, and now you have access to a good high paying job that you can support a family on. That pathway has been completely upended, all parts of that. Right, so much more expensive to go to college now. If you're from a middle class family, you're going to graduate with $30,000 of debt, even if you go to your local public college. And all of a sudden, the wages that you're getting paid aren't going to necessarily make up for the fact that you have to pay $500 or $600 a month to pay off your loan for decades. And so, trying to do some public education about that is really important. And I think, frankly, we had to do some of that within the administration, because I think people needed to wrap their arms around the fact that this was not an elitist problem. This is a very middle-class problem that if you did something about it would really resonate with a big chunk of the electorate.
I would actually say it's a working class and a middle class problem. I would say it's an American dream issue. I think that John is right, that that's why I go back to the fairness piece, which I think is unifying. I think that the big disconnect is what John just said, that most people my age, I graduated from college in 1980. So most people my age or older do not, unless they have grandkids who are wrestling through this process right now, have no idea how much more expensive it is to go to college right now than it was when I went to college and when others went to college. And the GI Bill I think, hugely offset the cost of college for lots of vets and lots of people in the, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think that that disconnect is really huge. And we have to actually deal with that disconnect, because that is the most important disconnect to overcome. And if you overcome that disconnect, the rest of this argument is about economic mobility and about a rising tide and about, wouldn't it be great that for first-generation students that they have lots of different options?
I want to get into a little bit of policy here. We've been talking about how the administration should message what it's done already on student debt relief. Obviously, there's a big open question of what the administration's next plan will look like. It's not a completely open question. They've released some drafts of what the structure of that new program or new effort will look like. And I'm wondering, Brett, you mentioned some of the features of the first program that addressed some of there was some income targeting, some targeting towards Pell Grant recipients, and the rationale, because it was the legal rationale, was that this was a response to the economic effects of the pandemic. We know now that the new program will have a totally different legal rationale, and that's probably a whole nother panel discussion about how the courts will approach that. But in terms of the policy structure and the policy questions, how, if you were still in the administration, how would you be proposing to lay out this new program based on what you think is good policy?
Well, look, I think that the Higher Education Act, which is the legal authority that this new debt relief approach will be using, is an extraordinarily broad grant of authority, right? It basically says the Secretary of Education may settle or cancel any debt, right, with no limitations attached to it. And so I think the administration, at least on its face, has a lot of flexibility in terms of how to design this type of debt relief. And I think that the approach that they've laid out so far in their proposed rulemaking makes a lot of sense. Essentially, they've identified several categories of borrowers that they think can get relief. People who, because of interest, owe far more than they originally took out, right? Maybe giving them some relief. People who've been making payments for 20, 25 plus years, that's a category of people who can get relief. And I think the biggest one that's still under consideration is folks who have experienced or are currently experiencing hardship in the course of repaying their loans. And to me, it all comes back to what Persis said, which is the reason that Congress passed the Higher Education Act, which created the federal student loan system, and that includes this settlement and compromise authority, was to create a pathway for financial mobility, economic mobility for students who might not otherwise get access to a college education. And perversely, this has now turned into, for millions and millions of people, a financial anchor on them. And so I think it's very much within the spirit of the Higher Education Act, as well as good policy, to provide very broad relief to student loan borrowers. Not necessarily identical to what was done the first time around with the HEROES Act announcement in August of 2022. But broadly speaking, in my view, as a policy matter, that very broad swath of borrowers, is about 40 million out of the 45 million borrowers, should get some relief, because I think that they have been victimized by a system that has, created all sorts of financial strain, and that was not in keeping with the purpose that Congress had in passing the Higher Education Act and giving all of this authority to the Secretary of Education. So my hope is, and my expectation is, that the administration will go pretty big on this, maybe by dividing it up into several different categories rather than doing it in one big fell swoop. But the justification is there, both as a legal matter and as a policy matter, for doing very broad relief in this context. And it's always important to remember, we live in a world of big numbers, right? And so 100 billion seems really big. $400 billion, first in context, in the PPP program, we did $1 trillion of relief to small business owners in about a year, okay? And we as a country survived that, right? And there was all sorts of benefits from it. But it's just important to remember that this is a $1.5 trillion loan portfolio. So of course, when you do something at any scale, it's going to result in a big number. But that doesn't mean that it's illegal or improper. That's just what it means to run a very, very large government program.
Randy, it seemed like at the end of last year, there was a little debate inside the administration about how big to go on this next student debt relief plan, and there was some reporting that where the education department ended at the end of the year, there was some pressure from progressives on the Hill and others outside for the White House to go bigger, and then they came out with this hardship sort of catch-all category in some sense for the next program. How are you thinking about the next program? What would you like to see the administration do there? And do you agree that maybe the mechanism might be different, but the top line number should rival what the president initially tried?
It has to rival that. I mean, I think you hear it from all of us that if you believe in economic mobility for the future of our country, and you see that student debt right now is unsustainable by virtue of even this one question or data point of how many people, because of interest costs, pay more than when they first took out the loan. And if you see that in not only so many polls, but in talking to people over and over and over again, then the number has to be big enough to create hope. And that means a number that people can then see that their life can materially change for the better and create the economic stability every American so yearns for by that number. And I think that, the issue about whether it should have, and this goes back to John's question about, making sure government works. At the end of the day, the Higher Ed Act is broader. The HEROES Act was about COVID relief. And so I think it should be big and bold. And I think that it is on us to explain it, but given John's polling, what we're saying to young people, just like we say about climate, just like we say about gun violence, is we want to leave you a better world than what you have right now.
Persis, how are you thinking about, I know you've written lots of policy proposals and memos on what the next relief plan should look like. What should it look like? And also, can you talk about the timeline here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Randy that it needs to go big and bold. And I think one of the things to think about as we kind of remember back to, August 22 and the original debt relief plan is how many people would have been completely relieved of their debts. And I think thinking about why that is, and it's because there are so many people that, we talk about these big astronomical numbers, but even small amounts of debt are causing a huge burden for so many people. And looking at that, the original pool of people who, and the anticipated relief was, how many of those folks were in default on their loans, right? That we knew that a greater proportion of borrowers in default would have benefited from that. And that is because that's the amount of the original program is the amount of hardship that exists. That number is not arbitrary. It is because it mirrors the actual harm that borrowers are experiencing. So I think, one of the ways that I think about how this has been structured is that, Bharat mentioned a number of the different discrete programs, and that's because there are real problems, real discrete problems. I made fun of us for talking about negative amortization at the beginning, but it's a really big problem, right? Like runaway interest is a really big problem. And so, coming up with a program that addresses that specific problem is critically important. But I think thinking more broadly about the way that we do hardship is that we just can't let anyone fall through the cracks. And I think that's the critical piece about this bigger, broader hardship piece, is that we just can't let people fall through the cracks. Public service loan forgiveness is critical. Income during payment is critical, but it is not capturing everybody. And so by having this broader hardship category, we have a better safety net to make sure that we're really getting that relief to folks. But to your question about timeline, right? Like, because timing is important. I think we're hoping to see the administration, with a proposal, in the next month or so that can be delivered by this summer. And I think the other piece about that is finding ways to deliver that automatically. What we know is that administrative burden prevents people from actually getting what they need. And so being able to not just deliver the rules, but then deliver the relief and as seamlessly as possible is what's going to put it in, make it real for the American public.
I know we're coming up on time. Any final takeaways, John, from your presentation that we should?
Yeah, I think the way that I think of this, and I think the way that most American voters think of this, is that when this context is understood, I'm just making my notes here. I think it does four big things, right? I think it makes government better. Okay, it builds confidence and trust in government. I think without question, it makes the economy stronger. This is not a zero sum. The funds that are saved are being invested in first-time homes or construction or just literally keeping that roof over your head. The number of younger people I talk to and see in focus groups who have been or concerned about losing their home is extraordinary. Okay, the Harvard poll of last spring showed that close to 40% of all members of this generation think that they themselves one day could be homeless. It's close to 50% of people of color, right? So again, it makes the economy stronger. Obviously, it makes families stronger. And one thing that's not fully, I think, appreciated is I think it makes people healthier, right? The concern that I have through other data about the anxiety, depression, 50% of people under 30, several days in the last 2 weeks, have had significant bouts of depression. Half of that number been so bad they've considered self-harm, a couple percent every single day. So for me, it helps with government, builds trust in government and the economy and families. It makes young people healthier.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me. This is a really interesting conversation, and please join me in thanking our panelists.